The world thinks Tokyo 1990 was the fall of a boxing god, but it was actually the public execution of a severely depressed addict. Months before stepping into the ring, Mike Tyson was already a hollowed-out shell, rotting from the inside due to heavy alcohol and chronic cocaine binges. The true horror wasn't the knockout punch. It was the sickening cruelty in his own corner. While his body generated hundreds of millions of dollars, his parasitic handlers didn't even pack a basic medical ice bag, resorting to shoving tap water ice into a cheap latex glove as his eye swelled shut. How did a ruthless industry force a broken man into the ring for one last payday? Let's find out. The turning point was not a moment of sporting ambition. It was a severe trauma response. When an older neighborhood gang member tore the head off one of Tyson's pigeons, the 10-year-old retaliated with extreme violence. It was a physical manifestation of survival. From that day, aggression became his primary coping mechanism. The violence was not born of malice, it was a desperate psychological shield against a hostile environment. He quickly assimilated into the street culture, joining a local gang known as the Jolly Stompers. He became a seasoned mugger, participating in armed robberies and burglaries before he hit puberty. The juvenile justice system processed him repeatedly. By the time Tyson was 13 years old, the New York Police Department had arrested him 38 times. He was categorized by the state as a statistical write-off, a chronic recidivist destined for the state penitentiary. He was removed from society and incarcerated at the Tryon School for Boys, a secure juvenile detention center in upstate New York. At Tryon, the raw material was identified. Bobby Stewart, a juvenile counselor and former Golden Gloves champion, recognized the abnormal physical power of the 13-year-old inmate. Stewart used boxing as a behavioral control mechanism, exchanging sparring sessions for Tyson's compliance with facility rules. When Tyson's physical capabilities rapidly outgrew Stewart's ability to train him, Stewart facilitated an introduction that would alter the trajectory of global sports history. He brought Tyson to Cus D'Amato. Cus D'Amato operated a boxing gym in Catskill, New York. He was an aging, deeply paranoid boxing manager who had previously guided Floyd Patterson and Jose Torres to world championships. D'Amato had spent decades entirely alienated from the mainstream boxing establishment, convinced the industry was controlled by a corrupt syndicate. He lived in self-imposed exile, searching for a physical vessel capable of exacting his revenge on the boxing world. In the 13-year-old, 200-pound juvenile delinquent from Brownsville, D'Amato found the perfect instrument. D'Amato did not operate as a traditional coach. He functioned as a psychological programmer. He moved Tyson out of the juvenile facility and into his massive Victorian house in Catskill. The environment was highly controlled, isolated, and strictly militaristic. D'Amato understood that Tyson was a terrified, emotionally stunted child. Instead of providing traditional therapy, D'Amato weaponized the fear. He implemented a strict regimen of psychological conditioning, utilizing daily affirmations and amateur hypnosis to dismantle the frightened street kid and construct an alter ego capable of inflicting maximum damage without hesitation. D'Amato taught Tyson that fear was like fire. It could either burn down your house or cook your food. He programmed the boy to project an aura of absolute sociopathy. When Lorna Tyson died of cancer in 1982, the 16-year-old felt almost no emotional impact. The emotional centers of his brain had been entirely compartmentalized. D'Amato immediately moved to become Tyson's legal guardian. This legal maneuver severed Tyson's final connection to his past. The boy was now entirely dependent on the Catskill ecosystem. He had no formal education, no life skills outside of combat, and no understanding of personal finance. His entire self-worth was directly tied to his ability to execute D'Amato's specific brand of violence. The professional execution began in March 1985. The rollout was relentless. Tyson fought 15 times in his first year as a professional, an unprecedented schedule designed to fast-track this teenage weapon to maximum profitability. The packaging of Iron Mike was deliberate psychological warfare. D'Amato stripped away the traditional pageantry of boxing. Tyson entered the ring with no robe, no socks, wearing only plain black trunks and black shoes. He looked like an executioner. The presentation was designed to break the opponent's will before the first bell rang. He won his first 19 fights by knockout, leaving a trail of unconscious men across secondary arenas in upstate New York before the national television networks took notice. In November 1986, at 20 years and 4 months old, the programmed weapon was pointed at Trevor Berbick for the WBC Heavyweight Championship. Tyson systematically dismantled Berbick in 2 rounds. He became the youngest heavyweight champion in the history of the sport. The world witnessed a seemingly indestructible force of nature. In 1988, he faced the undefeated lineal champion Michael Spinks in Atlantic City. The fight generated a record-breaking $70 million. Tyson annihilated Spinks in exactly 91 seconds. He was now the undisputed unified heavyweight champion of the world. He was the most recognizable and lucrative athletic property on the planet. But the invincibility was a carefully constructed illusion. The violence on the canvas was merely the outward projection of a highly specific defense mechanism. The Iron Mike persona was a heavy, impenetrable suit of armor, but the operator inside the suit was still an emotionally crippled, uneducated orphan who possessed zero tools to navigate the multi-million-dollar industry he now dominated. The entire operational stability of this multi-million-dollar enterprise relied completely on the presence of Cus D'Amato and his inner circle. They were the only firewall protecting the asset from the predatory realities of the capitalist sports complex. If that firewall were to collapse, the young fighter would be left entirely exposed to the worst elements of the industry. Cus D'Amato died of pneumonia on November 4th, 1985. Michael Tyson was 19 years old. He had only 11 professional fights. The man who dictated his schedule, his training, and his behavior was gone. This was the first crack in the foundation. But the structure did not collapse immediately. D'Amato had a backup plan. He had transferred Tyson's managerial contracts to Jim Jacobs and Bill Caton. Jacobs and Caton were wealthy fight historians. They owned the largest archive of boxing film in the world. They had financed D'Amato's gym in Catskill for years. When D'Amato died, Jacobs stepped in as the day-to-day manager. Caton handled the money, the contracts, and the corporate strategy. In the gym, Kevin Rooney took over as head trainer. Rooney was D'Amato's former fighter. He enforced D'Amato's strict rules. He made Tyson run at 4:30 a.m. He demanded the specific peekaboo head movement that made Tyson impossible to hit. For 3 years, This group kept Tyson focused. They guided him to the heavyweight championship in 1986. They negotiated the contracts that made him a millionaire. They took a 33.3% cut of his earnings. This was a high fee, but it was standard for managers who had bankrolled a fighter from the amateur ranks. Then the second death destroyed the camp entirely. Jim Jacobs died on March 23, 1988. The cause of death was chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Jacobs and Caton had known about the cancer for years. They deliberately hid the diagnosis from Tyson. They claimed they wanted to protect the fighter from distractions before his bouts. When Jacobs died, Tyson did not just grieve. He was furious. He felt lied to. He realized his handlers viewed him as a product to be managed, not a person to be trusted. This left Bill Caton in charge. Tyson did not like Caton. Caton was a cold, calculating businessman operating out of a Manhattan office. He did not go to the gym. He did not relate to a kid from Brownsville. Tyson was now 21 years old. He stood at the absolute pinnacle of the sport. He was making tens of millions of dollars. But he had an 8th grade education. He did not understand tax brackets, investment portfolios, or contract law. He only understood that a man he did not trust was taking 1/3 of his money. This created a massive opening. Don King saw the vulnerability and walked right in. Don King was not a standard sports promoter. He was a convicted killer. In 1966, King stomped an employee named Sam Garrett to death on the streets of Cleveland over a $600 gambling debt. King served nearly 4 years in prison for manslaughter. He understood street violence and he understood manipulation. King knew he could not win Tyson over with business spreadsheets. Instead, King exploited Tyson's lack of education and his deep sense of isolation. King bypassed Bill Caton completely and went straight to the fighter. He used race as his primary tool to divide the camp. King repeatedly told Tyson that white managers like Caton had a long history of treating black fighters like slaves. King pointed to the 33.3% cut. He told Tyson that Caton was stealing from him. King did not need to prove the theft. He only needed to make Tyson paranoid. For a young man who grew up in the streets expecting to be robbed, the paranoia set in immediately. King told Tyson that they shared the same background. He positioned himself as a father figure, a protector, and a brother. He promised Tyson that a black promoter would never exploit a black fighter. It was a calculated, devastating lie. To take control of the money, King had to get rid of Bill Caton. King convinced Tyson to file a lawsuit against Caton in the summer of 1988. The goal was to break the management contract. Tyson publicly accused Caton of withholding financial records. The pressure worked. Caton wanted to keep his hands on the massive revenue stream, so he agreed to settle out of court. The settlement reduced Caton's cut from 33.3% to 20%. More importantly, it stripped Caton of all his decision-making power. Caton was reduced to a ghost. He still collected a check, but he had zero input on Tyson's career. Don King now controlled the promotion and the matchmaking. But King had one final obstacle to remove: Kevin Rooney. Rooney was the head trainer. He was the only man left who demanded discipline. Rooney forced Tyson to train hard. Rooney also saw exactly what Don King was doing. He watched King surround Tyson with yes men. Rooney went to the press. He publicly stated that Don King was a negative influence and was destroying the heavyweight champion. In Don King's operation, nobody was allowed to criticize the boss. King demanded absolute loyalty. He pressured Tyson to choose between his trainer and his new promoter. Tyson, fully manipulated by King's promises of independence and racial solidarity, made the final cut. In December 1988, just weeks before a scheduled fight against Frank Bruno, Tyson fired Kevin Rooney. This was the fatal mistake. Tyson fired the only man who knew how to maintain his physical skills. King quickly replaced Rooney with his own employees. He brought in Aaron Snowell to be the head trainer. Snowell was not an elite boxing coach. He was a subservient employee who reported directly to Don King. Snowell had no authority over Tyson. If Tyson refused to do his morning run, Snowell said nothing. If Tyson wanted to cut sparring short, Snowell agreed. King then installed John Horn and Rory Holloway as Tyson's co-managers. They were not experienced sports executives. They were friends and enablers. Their job was not to manage Tyson's career. Their job was to keep Tyson happy, keep him distracted, and keep him completely dependent on Don King. By the end of 1988, the takeover was complete. Every professional from the Customato era was gone. The strict training camp in Catskill was abandoned. Tyson was now surrounded exclusively by people on Don King's payroll. Nobody told him no. Nobody forced him to train. Nobody reviewed the contracts King put in front of him. Tyson thought he was finally the boss. The reality was the exact opposite. The protective walls were completely torn down. The champion was isolated, uneducated, and sitting in a room full of vultures. The bleeding of his fortune and the destruction of his body was about to begin. With Kevin Rooney fired and Bill Caton stripped of his operational power, Don King gained absolute control over Tyson's entire career. The year 1988 marked the transition of Michael Tyson from an independent athlete into a captive revenue generator. King immediately relocated the center of Tyson's operations from the isolated, disciplined environment of Catskill to the unregulated casino floors of Las Vegas and Atlantic City. This was a strategic relocation. King understood that to maximize extraction, the fighter needed to be constantly surrounded by the machinery of excess. To comprehend the exploitation, you have to examine the financial mechanics of a Don King promotion. The public saw a heavyweight champion making millions. The reality was a masterclass in corporate skimming. King operated through his company, Don King Productions. King did not just take a percentage of Tyson's purse, he controlled the entire financial ecosystem surrounding the fight. When a casino like the Trump Plaza or the Mirage wanted to host a Tyson fight, they paid a massive site fee. That site fee went directly to DKP, not Tyson. When HBO or Showtime purchased the broadcast rights, the check was cut to DKP. King secured the international television rights, the closed-circuit revenue, and the merchandising rights. Tyson was paid a guaranteed purse, a fixed number that represented only a fraction of the gross revenue his body generated. Worse, King used a system of internal accounting to drain even that guaranteed purse. DKP charged Tyson for his own training camps. They charged him for the sparring partners. They charged him for the hotel rooms of King's massive entourage. They even charged Tyson a consulting fee for King's services, effectively making the fighter pay his promoter for the privilege of being promoted. Tyson, lacking basic financial literacy, routinely signed blank contracts and unread addendums. The system was designed to ensure that by the time the money reached the fighter, it had been aggressively filtered through King's corporate entities. However, Don King was not the only party attempting to extract wealth from the champion. In February 1988, Tyson married television actress Robin Givens. The marriage immediately triggered a vicious turf war over the asset. Givens and her mother, Ruth Roper, recognized the financial vulnerability of Tyson. They demanded access to the Caton accounts and the DKP contracts. They wanted a seat at the table. King viewed Givens and Roper as direct threats to his monopoly. Tyson was caught in the crossfire of this multi-million-dollar tug of war. He was not treated as a husband or a client. He was the prize in a corporate standoff. The psychological pressure of this dual-front exploitation shattered Tyson's remaining stability. The disciplined fighter built by Cus D'Amato vanished, replaced by an erratic, highly volatile individual. The physical and financial consequences were immediate. In August 1988 at 4 a.m., Tyson was involved in a street fight outside Dapper Dan's boutique in Harlem with former opponent Mitch Green. Tyson punched Green in the face, fracturing his own right hand in the process. This was a catastrophic financial event for the network and the promoters. Tyson was scheduled to defend his title against Frank Bruno. The broken hand delayed the fight, stalling millions of dollars in revenue. The promoters, the casino executives, and the television networks were losing money by the week. They needed the assets stabilized and returned to the ring immediately. Weeks later, on September 4th, 1988, the situation escalated into a critical medical emergency. Tyson crashed his BMW into a tree outside of Catskill. He was knocked unconscious and suffered a concussion. The New York Daily News reported the incident as a suicide attempt. The fighter was clearly experiencing a severe mental health crisis. He was dealing with a broken hand, head trauma, extreme depression, and the immense stress of a highly toxic marriage and manipulative management. Standard medical protocol for an athlete in this condition is immediate suspension, comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, and months of physical rest. But the boxing industry does not operate on medical ethics. The system could not afford a suspended champion. They needed a compliant one. Instead of providing the required therapy to address his profound childhood trauma and current severe depression, the factions surrounding Tyson opted for chemical containment. Doctors hired during the Givens era diagnosed Tyson as manic depressive. The medical solution was brutal. They prescribed him heavy central nervous system depressants, including lithium and thorazine. Thorazine is a high-potency antipsychotic historically used to treat schizophrenia. It is a chemical straitjacket. It drastically slows motor function, destroys hand-eye coordination, induces extreme lethargy, and numbs the cognitive processes. Prescribing this level of heavy sedation to an elite heavyweight boxer, a man whose physical survival depends entirely on split-second reflexes and spatial awareness, was an act of gross medical negligence. The objective of the medication was not to heal the man. It was to chemically sedate a highly lucrative property. The factions needed him docile enough to stop crashing cars, stop getting into street fights, and fulfill his media obligations so the promotional machine could keep generating cash. The horrific climax of this chemical containment strategy occurred on September 30th, 1988, on national television. Barbara Walters conducted a sit-down interview with Tyson and Givens for the ABC network. It remains one of the most disturbing pieces of sports media ever broadcast. Tyson sat next to his wife, visibly impaired. His eyes were glazed. His facial muscles were completely slack. He stared blankly at the floor, barely able to string together a coherent sentence. He was heavily sedated under the influence of the prescribed antipsychotics. During the interview, Givens openly described life with Tyson as pure hell, calling him scary and a manic depressive. She systematically dismantled him on camera. Tyson, trapped in a chemical fog, simply sat there and agreed. He was completely incapable of defending himself. The complicity of the media in this moment was absolute. Barbara Walters, an experienced journalist, saw a man who was clearly incapacitated by heavy medication. She did not stop the interview. She did not ask for a doctor. She did not question the ethics of interrogating a heavily sedated patient on national television. Instead, the camera crew zoomed in on his vacant, drooling expression. The network prioritized the viral spectacle over basic human decency. They broadcast the humiliation of a drugged, mentally broken 22-year-old to 50 million viewers. It was a ratings blockbuster. The athletic commissions, the sanctioning bodies, and the television networks all watched that broadcast. They all saw the most feared combat athlete on earth effectively paralyzed by antipsychotic medication. Not a single authority intervened. There were no investigations into his medical fitness to fight. There were no inquiries into the doctors prescribing Thorazine. The system collectively agreed to look the other way. By the end of 1988, the marriage to Givens collapsed in a highly publicized divorce that cost Tyson millions of dollars in settlements. Ruth Roper and Robin Givens exited the ecosystem. This left Don King as the sole, uncontested controller of the Michael Tyson monopoly. The financial draining had accelerated. The physical discipline was completely gone. The mental health crisis had been masked by heavy pharmaceuticals. Tyson's physical and mental foundation was thoroughly compromised, operating on borrowed time and rapidly decaying muscle memory. Don King brushed off the chaos, booked the next venue, and fired the money machine back up for 1989. The foundation for the total physical collapse in Tokyo had been permanently laid. The year is 1990. The destination is the Tokyo Dome. The public narrative framed the upcoming bout against James Buster Douglas as a routine execution. Las Vegas, odds makers, set the betting line at 42-1 in favor of the champion. The casino executives at the Mirage had already drafted a $24 million contract for Tyson's next fight against Evander Holyfield. The Tokyo fight was designed by Don King as a high-yield, low-risk exhibition. The objective was to keep the international revenue flowing while finalizing the Las Vegas megafight. That was the corporate spreadsheet. The physiological and psychological reality of the fighter was entirely different. His body and mind were on the verge of total systemic failure. By January 1990, the physical machinery of Michael Tyson was in a state of rapid, unmanaged decay. The peekaboo boxing style programmed by Cus D'Amato is notoriously punishing. It requires supreme cardiovascular conditioning, explosive fast-twitch muscle fibers, and relentless head movement to slip incoming punches. It demands a monk-like dedication to road work and stamina. Tyson was no longer functioning under these parameters. He had replaced the heavy bag in the morning runs with chronic cocaine abuse and heavy alcohol consumption. He was self-medicating. He was attempting to anesthetize his untreated clinical depression and the trauma of his public, highly humiliating divorce. Cocaine is a brutal central nervous system stimulant. It severely elevates the heart rate, restricts blood vessels, and completely disrupts the sleep cycle. Tyson was routinely staying awake for days at a time. The physical toll on an elite athlete was immediate and devastating. He lost his muscle elasticity. His reflexes dulled. His weight ballooned. He was physically rotting from the inside out. When Don King's operation moved the training camp to Japan weeks before the fight, it was not a preparation zone. It was an unregulated circus. Head trainer Aaron Snowell and the newly appointed sycophants exerted zero authority. The Tokyo hotel suites were filled with women, alcohol, and enablers. Tyson actively avoided the gym. When he was forced to prepare, he engaged in rapid, dehydrating weight cuts to strip the fat, a process that severely depletes the cerebrospinal fluid protecting the brain. He was entering a combat zone structurally compromised. The definitive medical alarm sounded on January 22, 1990, exactly 20 days before the scheduled bout. It happened during a heavily attended sparring session. Tyson stepped into the ring with Greg Page, a seasoned heavyweight and former WBA champion. Tyson was sluggish, flat-footed, and entirely lacking his signature defensive head movement. Page threw a standard hard right hand. It connected clean on Tyson's jaw. The supposedly invincible title holder collapsed heavily to the canvas. He was dropped in front of the Japanese media and Don King's entire entourage. He was bleeding from the nose and visibly disoriented. In a regulated, ethically sound sporting environment, a knockout during a sparring session triggers an immediate medical shutdown. The brain has sustained concussive trauma. The fighter is suspended. Neurological exams are strictly mandated. The fight is postponed to prevent fatal secondary impact syndrome. But the boxing industry is not regulated by medical ethics. It is regulated by cash flow. The Tokyo Dome event was backed by multi-million-dollar television rights, massive live gate projections, and the pending $24 million Holyfield contract. A medical suspension would cost the promoters, the casinos, and the networks an absolute fortune. The response from Don King's apparatus was immediate suppression. They aggressively downplayed the knockdown to the press. They claimed Tyson had merely slipped or was suffering from jet lag. They actively concealed the severity of the concussive trauma. Don King did not care that his fighter had just suffered a brain injury 3 weeks before a championship bout. The priority was protecting the betting lines and securing the television money. More damning than Don King's greed was the absolute complicity of the Japanese Boxing Commission. As the regulatory body sanctioning the bout, the JBC had a legal and ethical mandate to protect the fighters. They witnessed the heavily publicized sparring knockdown. They saw a heavily favored champion clearly suffering from physical deterioration and neurological vulnerability. The JBC had the authority to demand immediate brain scans. They chose to ignore their own safety mandates. They bypassed strict medical evaluations. The massive influx of foreign capital, the international media attention, and the political pressure from Don King Productions overrode basic human safety. The regulatory body greenlit a clinically depressed, neurologically compromised patient to fight. The contrast between the two men entering the ring was stark, but completely hidden from the public eye. James Buster Douglas was fighting for survival. His mother had died just 23 days before the fight. He was motivated by profound, focused grief. He was in the best physical and mental condition of his life. Tyson, conversely, was fighting solely to service the debt cycle of his promoter. He was chemically exhausted, structurally damaged, and isolated. At the official weigh-in, the physical evidence of Tyson's neglect was undeniable. He stepped on the scale at 220 pounds, but the number was a deceptive metric. He lacked muscle definition. He looked soft, lethargic, and entirely detached from the reality of the impending violence. His eyes were vacant. The system surrounding him, the promoters, the cornermen, the casino executives, collectively held their breath. They knew the asset was broken. They were simply gambling that the decaying muscle memory of Cus D'Amato's programming would be enough to secure one final, rapid knockout. They needed Tyson to land a quick punch so they could cash the Tokyo checks and move on to the massive Mirage payout before the public realized the machine was completely empty. The stage was set for a public execution. The bell rang inside the Tokyo Dome on February 11, 1990. Nearly 40,000 spectators sat in the arena. Millions more watched via international pay-per-view. The Las Vegas sportsbooks had locked the betting lines at 42-1. The executives at the Mirage Hotel and Casino had the paperwork for a $24 million contract against Evander Holyfield, sitting in a secure vault, awaiting a simple signature. The entire global boxing economy was banking on a routine execution. Instead, they witnessed the complete systemic collapse of a neglected asset. From the opening seconds of the first round, the biological reality of Tyson's physical decay was exposed. James Buster Douglas did not run. He stepped to the center of the ring and established a heavy piston-like left jab. To neutralize a taller fighter's jab, Cus D'Amato's peekaboo system requires constant kinetic energy. The fighter must aggressively bob and weave, slipping the punch to close the distance. Tyson had no kinetic energy. His legs were dead. The weeks of cocaine abuse, extreme sleep deprivation, and sudden dehydrating weight cuts had completely drained his fast-twitch muscle fibers. He was flat-footed. He could not move his head. Consequently, he absorbed the blunt force trauma of Douglas's jab directly to the cranium. Snap, snap, the damage accumulated immediately. In the blue corner, absolute chaos replaced professional instruction. When Tyson returned to his stool after the early rounds, he received zero tactical guidance. Aaron Snowell and Jay Bright were not elite boxing strategists. They were Don King's payroll employees. They did not understand the mechanics of the peekaboo style. They could not diagnose the distance errors. As Douglas methodically dismantled their fighter, Snowell and Bright panicked. They resorted to screaming, empty, useless slogans. "Bite down, Mike. Let your hands go." They were spectators standing on the apron. The protective, disciplined corner that once diagnosed incoming threats and adjusted strategy was gone. Tyson was entirely on his own. By the fifth round, the physiological consequences of taking repeated, unmitigated trauma to the face materialized. Tyson's left eye began to swell. Blood vessels ruptured under the skin of the orbital bone. Fluid rapidly pooled in the tissue. In the professional fight industry, facial swelling is a standard crisis. It requires a standard, immediate medical solution. A competent cutman utilizes an end swell, a small, thick piece of stainless steel kept buried in a bucket of ice. When pressed against the damaged tissue between rounds, the freezing metal constricts the blood vessels and violently halts the swelling. An end swell is the most basic, fundamental tool in combat sports. It costs exactly $10. Don King Productions generated tens of millions of dollars for the Tokyo event. They flew an entourage of dozens of sycophants, hangers-on, and executives first class across the Pacific. They booked luxury penthouse suites. Yet, nobody in Tyson's corner packed an end swell. In the middle of a heavyweight championship fight dictating the future of a $100 million industry, the management team failed to provide a $10 piece of basic medical equipment. The negligence escalated from incompetent to grotesque. As Tyson's eye closed rapidly, Snow realized the oversight. Desperate to stem the swelling, the corner scrambled. They grabbed a standard rubber latex glove. They shoved tap water ice cubes inside it and tied it off. Between rounds, they pressed this makeshift, leaking balloon against the orbital bone of the man they relied on to generate hundreds of millions of dollars. It was a complete medical failure. The uneven ice shifted. The latex provided zero uniform compression. Warm water leaked directly into Tyson's eyes and down his chest. The swelling accelerated aggressively. By the 8th round, Tyson's left eye was completely swollen shut. A massive purple hematoma blinded him on his left side. Tyson was now fighting half blind, structurally exhausted, and taking heavy punishment from a 230-pound opponent. This was not a stroke of bad luck in the ring. This was the direct, undeniable consequence of Don King stripping away competent professionals and replacing them with cheap, compliant amateurs. The system refused to invest a single cent in the physical preservation of the fighter. In the final seconds of the 8th round, the decaying muscle memory of Tyson's past briefly surfaced. He landed a desperate, catastrophic right uppercut. Douglas collapsed to the canvas. The referee initiated the count. Due to a delay in picking up the timekeeper's cadence, Douglas remained on the floor for roughly 12 seconds before rising. He survived the round. It was the last gasp of the Michael Tyson machine. The adrenaline dump from that knockdown emptied Tyson's remaining physiological reserves. The ultimate extraction occurred in the 10th round. Douglas backed a blinded, exhausted Tyson into the ropes and unleashed a devastating 5-punch combination. A brutal right uppercut snapped Tyson's head violently backward, scrambling his equilibrium. 4 subsequent punches connected clean on his jaw. Tyson collapsed. He hit the canvas heavily. The damage was severe. He rolled onto his hands and knees, visibly concussed, his brain slamming against the inside of his skull. In a pathetic, deeply disturbing image, the blind, bleeding champion fumbled blindly on the floor, found his mouthpiece, and tried to shove it sideways into his mouth as the referee waved off the fight. The machine was officially broken. The asset was neutralized. The cash flow was severed. Watch the immediate aftermath of the knockout. Watch the behavior of the promoter. When a fighter takes that level of concussive head trauma, a standard manager or promoter rushes the ring. They ensure the ringside physician is immediately in the ring. They check the fighter's vitals. They prepare for a potential stretcher or a trip to the local trauma center to check for a subdural hematoma. Don King did not look at Michael Tyson. He did not step into the ring to help his fighter off the canvas. The moment Tyson was counted out, King immediately pivoted. He stormed the ringside officials' table. He began screaming at the World Boxing Council representatives and the Japanese commissioners. He pointed frantically at the video monitors. He demanded an immediate official protest of the referee's count during the 8th round knockdown. King initiated a desperate bureaucratic maneuver to void the knockout, overturn the result to a Tyson victory, and salvage the $24 million Holyfield contract. Tyson sat on the stool in the corner, bleeding, concussed, and entirely alone. His physical survival was completely irrelevant. The capitalist machinery only values the asset while it operates and generates revenue. The exact second the asset breaks down, the priority shifts entirely to salvaging the paperwork. King did not care if Tyson had a brain bleed. He cared about the contract in Las Vegas. The latex glove in the corner and the immediate ringside protest exposed the core truth of the operation. They manufactured the monster, they drained the money, and they left the man to rot on the canvas. The destruction in Tokyo shattered the illusion of invincibility, but the corporate debt remained. Don King Productions had lost the massive guaranteed revenue of the Evander Holyfield contract. The asset had depreciated, but it still possessed immense market value. King immediately initiated a salvage operation. He did not grant Tyson time to physically heal from the concussive trauma or address the underlying clinical depression. The machine demanded rapid capital injection. By June 1990, just 4 months after the Douglas knockout, Tyson was shoved back into the ring against Henry Tillman. He fought Alex Stewart later that same year. Tyson knocked both men out in the first round, but the footage reveals a critical mechanical failure. The fighter who dismantled the heavyweight division in the 1980s was dead. The head movement was gone. The combination punching was gone. The disciplined footwork programmed by Cus D'Amato had been completely erased. Tyson had devolved into a raw headhunter. He relied entirely on blunt force trauma and intimidation to finish fights quickly. This degradation was violently exposed in 1991 during 2 grueling bouts against Donovan "Razor" Ruddock. These were not boxing matches, they were brutal attritional street fights. Tyson absorbed massive unnecessary punishment to secure the victories. He was trading his neurological health for paychecks to keep the Don King promotional engine running. Then, the firewall of celebrity protection completely collapsed. In July 1991, Tyson attended the Miss Black America pageant in Indianapolis, Indiana. During the event, he met an 18-year-old contestant named Desiree Washington. The subsequent events moved from a hotel room into the criminal justice system. Washington accused Tyson of rape. For years, Tyson had operated under a dangerous delusion engineered by his environment. He believed his status as a heavyweight champion, combined with Don King's vast influence and legal retainers, granted him immunity from consequence. He had paid his way out of street fights, car crashes, and contract disputes. But the Marion County court system was not a Las Vegas boxing commission. The trial commenced in early 1992. The defense strategy was arrogant and deeply flawed, treating the proceedings as a minor inconvenience rather than a life-altering threat. On February 10, 1992, A jury convicted Michael Tyson of 1 count of rape and 2 counts of criminal deviant conduct. The judge sentenced him to 6 years in state prison. The system that enabled, exploited, and insulated his worst behavior immediately detached. Don King did not go to jail. The casino executives did not go to jail. The entourage vanished. The multi-million-dollar asset was stripped of his wealth, his title, and his freedom, locked inside a 10-by-8 cell at the Indiana Youth Center. Tyson was held fully accountable for his actions, serving 3 solid years in a maximum security environment. When Tyson was released on parole in March 1995, he was 28 years old. Athletically, he was a fossil. 3 years of physical stagnation in a state penitentiary had completely eroded his fast-twitch muscle fibers and timing. However, the Las Vegas apparatus did not care about his athletic viability. They only cared about his intellectual property. The myth of Iron Mike was still highly marketable. Don King orchestrated a massive, highly lucrative comeback. The MGM Grand Hotel and Casino signed Tyson to an exclusive multi-fight contract. The promotional buildup was entirely predatory, selling the public a ghost. In August 1995, Tyson fought Peter McNeely, an overmatched club fighter. The bout lasted exactly 89 seconds. The event generated nearly $100 million in gross revenue. The system realized a terrifying financial truth. Tyson did not need to be competent to generate cash. He only needed to be present. But the facade could not withstand a legitimate athletic stress test. In November 1996, the promoters matched Tyson against Evander Holyfield. Holyfield was a master tactician. He recognized that Tyson was structurally compromised, strictly a one-punch fighter lacking any defensive mechanics. More importantly, Holyfield recognized Tyson's severe psychological fragility. During the fight, Holyfield physically bullied the former champion. He tied Tyson up, leaned his heavy torso on him to drain his legs, and repeatedly utilized his head as a battering ram in the clinches. Tyson, completely unequipped to problem-solve inside the ring, was systematically battered and stopped in the 11th round. The rematch occurred in June 1997. It produced the most infamous, violently misunderstood moment in modern sports history. In the 3rd round, frustrated by repeated unpenalized headbutts from Holyfield, Tyson snapped. He spit out his mouthpiece and bit off a 1-inch piece of Holyfield's right ear, spitting the cartilage onto the canvas. The media universally framed the act as cowardice. The clinical reality is far darker. This was a severe trauma response. Tyson was a deeply stunted, emotionally unstable man pushed into a corner on a global stage, stripped of the boxing techniques that once protected him, and lacking the emotional regulation to process adversity. His brain bypassed all professional training and reverted instantly to the primal, desperate violence of the Brownsville streets. It was the absolute psychological detonation of a broken man. The Nevada State Athletic Commission revoked his boxing license and fined him $3 million. The financial collapse ran parallel to the psychological decay. During his career, Michael Tyson generated an estimated $300 million in gross purses. By the turn of the decade, the money was gone. The financial hemorrhage was a combination of Tyson's pathological spending habits and the systematic skimming executed by Don King Productions. Tyson bought multi-million-dollar mansions, fleets of luxury vehicles, and Bengal tigers. But the heavier damage was done on paper. King's contracts ensured the promoter took massive percentages of the gross revenue before Tyson saw a dime. Furthermore, Tyson was bleeding capital through exorbitant legal fees, aggressive divorce settlements, and catastrophic tax mismanagement. In August 2003, the man who once generated over $300 million in the ring filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in New York. The court documents expose the staggering reality of his exploitation and incompetence. Tyson listed his assets at practically zero. His liabilities exceeded $23 million. He owed the IRS $13.4 million in unpaid federal taxes. He owed the British tax authorities another $4 million. He owed millions to various law firms, financial managers, and former trainers. The capitalist machine is ruthless. The IRS demanded payment, threatening federal prison for tax evasion. To stave off incarceration, the system forced the bankrupt, aging asset back to work. The final years of Tyson's career were a pathetic, highly dangerous charade. He admitted to chronic substance abuse during this period, relying heavily on cocaine and marijuana to numb the humiliation. To bypass mandatory athletic commission drug tests and keep his license active, Tyson resorted to extreme deception. He admitted to using a whizzer, a prosthetic penis, filled with the clean urine of his wife or infant child. It was a desperate, degrading tactic executed simply to secure clearance to fight. He was marched out to take severe physical beatings strictly for debt collection. In 2002, Lennox Lewis administered a brutal systemic beating, knocking Tyson out in the 8th round. The purse money went directly to creditors. In 2004, a journeyman named Danny Williams knocked him out. Finally, in June 2005, the machine broke down for the last time. Kevin McBride, a slow, unathletic heavyweight, leaned on a thoroughly exhausted, bankrupt Tyson. At the end of the 6th round, Tyson quit on his stool. He refused to stand up. He told the ringside media he no longer had the fighting guts. He was 38 years old. The truth was not a lack of courage. The truth was that the promoters, the casinos, and his own destructive habits had finally extracted the absolute last drop of blood. The revenue stream was officially dead. The athletic window permanently closed on June 11th, 2005, in Washington, D.C. Michael Tyson quit on his stool against Kevin McBride. He did not possess the physical stamina or the psychological desire to continue absorbing blunt force trauma. However, retiring from professional boxing did not terminate his obligations to the machine. The Internal Revenue Service does not recognize athletic retirement. They recognize a $13.4 million federal tax deficit. The British tax authorities required another $4 million. The predatory loan companies, former managers, and legal retainers demanded the rest of the $23 million debt listed in his Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing. Tyson was a 38-year-old man with no formal education, severe physical deterioration, and a chronic cocaine addiction. The transition was brutal. The undisputed heavyweight champion of the world was relegated to setting up folding tables in Las Vegas casino lobbies, charging tourists $50 for an autograph. The same casino executives who previously generated tens of millions of dollars off his physical prime now allowed him to operate in their hallways as a novelty act to settle his debts. The private reality of Tyson's life during this period was a landscape of domestic instability and continuous substance abuse. His personal life was fractured across 3 marriages and multiple children. He attempted to manufacture a sense of grounding by converting to Islam and completing the Umrah pilgrimage to Mecca in 2010. He was searching for a rigid ideological structure to replace the void left by custamato, but religious conversion does not erase clinical trauma or cancel financial liabilities. In May 2009, the ultimate fatality occurred off the canvas. His 4-year-old daughter, Exodus, died from accidental asphyxiation after becoming entangled in a treadmill cord at their home in Phoenix, Arizona. The media coverage was relentless. They swarmed the funeral and dissected the tragedy for daytime television ratings. Tyson did not process the event with a cinematic epiphany. He processed it with heavy narcotics. He admitted to being entirely reliant on cocaine and alcohol during this period to numb the psychological baseline of his reality. Realizing that his physical capacity for combat was exhausted, the capitalist system surrounding Tyson executed a strategic pivot. If they could no longer sell his violence, they would sell his humiliation. The entertainment industry began repackaging the terrifying Iron Mike persona into a self-deprecating mascot. In 2009, Tyson secured a cameo in the Hollywood comedy The Hangover. The public laughed as he awkwardly sang Phil Collins and punched the lead actor. The audience believed they were watching a rehabilitated man demonstrating self-awareness. The factual reality was entirely different. Tyson later admitted he was heavily intoxicated on cocaine during the filming of the movie. He did not take the role to rehabilitate his image. He took the role because he desperately needed the upfront cash to satisfy his creditors. The system successfully monetized his drug addiction and his desperate financial state as comedic relief. This marked the beginning of a new extraction phase, the nostalgia economy. The industry realized that the Michael Tyson intellectual property still possessed massive brand recognition, regardless of the condition of the man holding the name. He was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame in 2011. This was not merely an honor, it was a mechanism to keep the IP relevant. Tyson launched a one-man stage show, Undisputed Truth, directed by Spike Lee. He initiated the Hot Boxin' podcast. He signed licensing deals for cannabis products and animated television shows. He allowed the media to document his every move. The system figured out how to extract capital from his verbalized trauma just as effectively as they had extracted it from his physical violence. But the sports entertainment complex is inherently greedy. Hollywood cameos and podcast advertising revenue were insufficient. The highest yield for the Tyson brand remained inside a boxing ring. In November 2020, during the height of the global pandemic, the machine activated the 54-year-old asset. They engineered an exhibition bout against 51-year-old Roy Jones Jr. The event was broadcast on a new streaming platform, Triller. It was sold purely on nostalgia. The fight generated over 1.6 million pay-per-view buys, grossing an estimated $80 million. The system realized a terrifying truth. The public would still pay massive premiums to watch a compromised elderly version of the monster they built in the 1980s. The ultimate indictment of this unregulated capitalist loop occurred in November 2024. Netflix, a global streaming corporation looking to dominate live sports broadcasting, required a recognizable spectacle. They did not hire prime elite athletes. They contracted Michael Tyson, now 58 years old, to fight Jake Paul, a 27-year-old YouTube influencer. The medical realities of this matchup were grotesque. Tyson was nearly 60. He suffered from chronic sciatica that periodically confined him to a wheelchair. Months before the scheduled bout, the fight was postponed because Tyson suffered a severe ulcer flare-up on a cross-country flight, requiring emergency medical intervention. He was coughing up blood. In a regulated industry, a 58-year-old man with a bleeding ulcer and a history of severe concussive trauma is permanently barred from professional combat. But the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation fully sanctioned the bout as a professional fight. The State Athletic Commission abandoned its fundamental mandate to protect human health in favor of the massive tax revenue generated by a sold-out AT&T stadium and a global Netflix broadcast. They fed a senior citizen to a man 3 decades younger strictly for streaming metrics. Tyson staggered through the rounds, his legs entirely gone, relying on the opponent to carry him to the final bell. It was a sterile, highly lucrative execution. The machine never stops. Even now, rumors circulate of a potential 2026 exhibition against Floyd Mayweather. It does not matter if Tyson is 60 years old. It does not matter if his neurological scans show degradation. If the algorithms indicate a profit margin, the contracts will be drafted. The story of Michael Gerard Tyson is not a sports narrative about winning and losing. It is a forensic blueprint of absolute exploitation. The American capitalist machinery found a traumatized, violent orphan in Brownsville and built him into a global god of war. They utilized clinical manipulation to isolate him from competent protection. They chemically sedated him to maintain his compliance. They ignored massive medical red flags to protect their site fees and casino betting lines. They extracted his physical prime, watched him go to a state penitentiary, and when his bank accounts hit zero, they brought him back to bleed for their debts. And decades after the physical prime vanished, they repackaged the damaged 58-year-old shell of that man and sold him to a streaming algorithm. The system creates the asset, it extracts the maximum possible yield, and it refuses to discard the body until the absolute final cent has been squeezed from the bone.